Today, India and China eliminate more girls than the number of girls born in America every year.
The definition of genocide is a systematic and methodical extermination of a certain group. And the gendercide is that systematic and methodical extermination of a gender group.
Why are Indian households secretly and brutally eliminating daughters from their family system?
They just wet the cloth and they fold it like this and they put it on the face. So the child can't breathe. Immediately the child will die.
But what this is an entire system, a social machinery that says we don't want females.
But the real problem started after I became pregnant. They started asking me for a sex determination. They wanted to know if the children are girls or boys. They started torturing me to get an abortion done. What should I do to save my daughters?
कि उसके सिर हिला के देखा तो वो तो यहाँ पे गले पे पूरा निशान पड़ा हुआ है। निशान पड़ने के बाद तब हमें फिर रोना पीटना, हमारे तो होश ही उड़ गए थे लड़की को देख के कि इसने मार कैसे दी।
如果按计划生育生的话，我就只能生2个。哎呀，反正在村子里都有专人搞这些工作的嘛，就被他们知道我们在那里。
மனசுல அதை வச்சிருக்க கூடாது. பையனா இருந்தா வச்சுக்கலாம், பெண்ணா இருந்தா ஒழிச்சு பண்ணலாம். அப்படி இப்படி பிடிச்சா தேர்ந்து போச்சு. பிறந்த உடனே நானே பாசிப்படுவேன். மறுபடி பையனே இல்லை அப்படின்னு 8 குழந்தைங்களாட்டம் கொண்டு விட்டோம்.
In India and China and other parts of the world today, girls are killed, aborted, and abandoned simply because they're girls. This female genocide, or as many are calling it, gendercide, has resulted in the elimination of as many as 200 million women just in the past few decades. It's a pretty staggering statistic. Just to put it in perspective for you, more girls have been killed over the past 50 years simply because they're girls than all of the deaths of World War I, World War II, and all the major battles of the 20th century combined. Just in the past decade, more girls have been eliminated than all of the genocidal events of the 20th century combined, including the Jewish Holocaust, Pol Pot, just add them all up. It's a staggering number. It's kind of hard to get your head around. Gendercide is just the tip of the iceberg, though, when it comes to the escalation of violence against women in the world today. 1 out of 3 women in the world today will experience violence or sexual assault within her lifetime. 1 out of 3 women. 2 out of 3 people in the world today living in poverty are women. Poverty really has a woman's face. Women do 2/3 of the world's work. They receive 10% of the world's income and own 1% of the means of production in the world today. It's estimated that as many as 100 million girls will be given as child brides just over the next decade. Child brides are victims of cultural norms that turn a blind eye to the exploitation, sexual exploitation and rape of little girls made legal through marriage. Neither physically nor emotionally ready to be mothers and wives, they are at far greater risk of experiencing dangerous complications for pregnancy and childbirth, becoming infected with HIV/AIDS, and and suffering domestic violence, and with little access to education and economic opportunity, they're much more likely, them and their families are much more likely to live in poverty. Rape has become a mental and emotional weapon of war today, increasingly targeting defenseless women and young girls. Female genital mutilation, according to the World Health Organization, about 140 million women and girls worldwide are currently living with the consequences of female genital mutilation. Just in Africa alone, an estimated 101 million girls are 10 years old and above have suffered this brutal non-medical procedure. It's believed to reduce a woman's libido and ensure premarital virginity and marital fidelity. But the price paid for those who suffer this is pretty high. A lifetime of pain, infections, increased risk of childbirth complications, sexual exploitation, and oftentimes even infertility. One of the greatest untold stories of violence today is that of widows. There are 80 million widows living in the world today who have been thrown out of their homes after the brutal aftermath of their husbands' deaths. They're facing strong social stigmas, and these stigmas ensure they really don't find the work or any kind of a friendly hand up. They are often left with few options, often resorting to prostitution or begging. They're subjected to social isolation, rape, murder, often forced into prostitution or remarriage. So this world war on women has reached a level really never seen before in history, and what we would expect to be with economic development and globalization and overall improvement in the plight of women has really been moving the opposite direction. The needle's been moving the other way. There's an epidemic of domestic murder. We've actually had to come up with new terms to describe the plight of women, like gendercide and like femicide. This epidemic of domestic murder throughout Africa and Latin America and honor killings throughout the Middle East and the rest of the world is being referred to as femicide because it's so often a phenomenon where women are killed by their own boyfriends, husbands, and fathers. It's a Girl was my first feature-length film. I have spent the last 2 decades traveling the world and working with humanitarian aid and development NGOs and missions organizations and ministries, helping them tell their story. And during that time, I've really encountered a lot of injustice in the world. But none of that experience over those years really prepared me for standing at the edge of that field in southern India when we went to film for this project and listening to this Indian woman smile as she shared about having strangled 8 of her own newborn daughters. I had to wonder, how is it that this woman could visit this kind of violence on her own daughters when she's coming from a culture where she's suffered so much under subjugation and devaluation. And I got a little bit of an insight into that a little bit later in the day when we were filming her. She sang us a song, and it was a song about her plight as a young girl given in marriage. And it was kind of her story. When she was 15, she had been given in marriage as a second wife to her sister's husband because her sister could not have children. And she had high hopes for her future. She was excelling in school when it was decided that she was going to become a second wife. And it was her purpose in life to bear her husband a son. This was something that was programmed into her by her culture from the time she was born, that this is your value, this is where your value comes from. So being able to see that, realizing that this woman stood before me was really simply a product of the culture in which she lived. This is a culture that is driven by centuries-old traditions that say boys are more valuable than girls. It's a culture in which millions of girls are selectively aborted each year, simply because they're girls. It's a culture in which the mortality rate of girls under the age of 5 is 75% higher than that of boys. And 1 out of 4 girls doesn't live past puberty. This is a culture in which those who do survive childhood have no control really over their own autonomy, their own destiny. Their fathers can give them in marriage as early as 8 or 10 years old. Once their guardianship is passed from their father to their husbands, he can beat her, he can rape her, he can sell her, he can kill her with very little consequence, fear of consequence. India is only one of many cultures that practice this extreme oppression and exploitation of women. There are patriarchal cultures that devalue and subjugate women. They can be found throughout Asia, Africa, Middle East, Latin America. And culture is something where we've all got our cultural blind spots. Here in the U.S., we've got our own, materialism, and there's so many beautiful things about the Indian culture as well. And we can all learn from each other as members of the world community. But as I've worked to educate and mobilize a movement to end gendercide in India and China through this film, It's a Girl, had the privilege of seeing It's a Girl show in over 500 screenings in 20 nations, and including at the European and British parliaments and on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. Privileged to be able to speak at many of these screenings and events at college and universities and conferences, and in that time have been able to interact with a lot of people who inevitably ask the question, how does culture change occur when it comes to such deeply ingrained, over centuries, embedded in the fabric of the culture, the devaluation and subjugation of women? How does that change begin to occur? So in my current film that I'm working on, I'm interacting with a lot of the women's rights movements, and their solution tends to be economic empowerment and education, which is good, which is extremely important. But when you take a country like India, where the highest skewed sex ratios are occurring among the more wealthy and higher educated classes and castes, it's clear to see that education and economic empowerment really isn't the silver bullet, that we might hope it to be. And there's deeper dynamics at work. And so as a part of this new film I'm working on, I've been studying and researching the anatomy of a movement. I believe, as you do, I'm sure, that we're all created by a loving God who cares about justice. And historically, Christians have been on the front lines of the battle for justice, just throughout history. So how can we as Christians be a part of the solution for this global epidemic, this global war on women? I've learned a lot from examining some of these movements that have won equality and dignity for women, like the women's suffrage movement and the women's liberation movement of the 60s and 70s, and other movements that have ended slavery and apartheid in South Africa, and some of the things have kind of risen out of that. I've learned a few things from that exercise. For instance, the movement that eventually turned the tide against foot binding in China began with Christian missionaries in the 1860s. In a article written by Kwame Anthony Appiah in the New York Times, he said, the wisest campaigners, this article was about the art of social change, the wisest campaigners began by insisting on their respect for China's civilization. Christian missionaries set up newspapers and magazines like Review of the Times, founded in 1868, which gave the elite access to classic Chinese to ideas and events from the world outside China. The Reverend Timothy Richard of the Baptist Missionary Society, who edited the Eastern Times for a period beginning in 1890, was highly influential too. Richard grasped that the key to China lay with the literati, the scholarly classes that produced the empire's policymakers. He dressed as they did. He learned their language. He studied the texts that formed the core of their education. So upon this foundation of respect and nurturing, honoring relationships with influential members of the community, missionaries were able to influence a movement that eventually led to the eradication of foot binding in China. Not all similar efforts ended as well. In the same article, Apai writes, in 1929, the Church of Scotland Mission, which had a long, successful history of missionary work among the Kikuyu in colonial Kenya, began a campaign to eradicate the practice of female circumcision. The results were hardly what church members hoped for. Large numbers of Kikuyu left the church, and Kenya's leading anti-colonial political organization mounted a vigorous attack on the church's policy. Female circumcision became a nationalist issue, and a custom that might have gradually disappeared grew further entrenched. Nearly 40% of Kenyan women today are estimated to have undergone some form of it. So here's an exercise that unfortunately went the other direction. But there's another beautiful example of a movement today that has successfully engaged over 100 villages in Senegal to vow to end the practice of female genital cutting. In this particular case, the movement started with a few women in one village who vowed to stop female genital cutting. And then you add Molly Melching from Illinois, who is now 60 years old and who moved to Senegal when she was 24 to work with street children and just never came back home. Add her to the mix, along with her relationship with the village imam, Mr. Dawera, who together with Molly, they worked out that there really was no religious requirement for cutting because it predated Islam by centuries. And they began speaking with other imams in villages nearby. Through understanding the culture, it was apparent that these one village wasn't enough because of the intermarrying with other surrounding villages. All of these villages really had to vow to end this practice if it was going to work. So this respected imam began traveling to the villages surrounding that with which his village intermarried, and advancing this idea, you know, this really isn't something that's a religious requirement of us, and it really hurts our women. Let's all agree. Now there's over 100 villages that have sworn to end female genital cutting in Senegal. Each one of us in this room are privileged to intersect with similar opportunities, whether it's right here in our backyard or whether it's anywhere in the world that you're working. We have those opportunities to build those respectful and honoring relationships and influence those small movements that can become larger movements, and addressing the justice issues that those people that we've grown to love are facing. We each have the potential to be the beginning of change, the beginning of a movement, restoring dignity and value to women and girls throughout the world. My passion is to tell the stories that help you communicate what you're up against. Those who are combating gendercide throughout the world use my film to mobilize and educate. And it's my privilege to be able to tell those stories and connect people with that emotional thing that's happening out there that really engages their heart in the issue rather than just their head. We might through statistics and articles. So I love telling those stories. And I hope you'll join me in the movement that I'm hoping. We've got now 500,000 people have joined our cause, joined our movement to combat gendercide, and it's just one by one people sharing the film, sharing the news about this issue. I never knew it existed at the beginning, and a lot of people who still see my film didn't know it existed, but now they do, and now they can make a choice. Am I going to stand up for this and help advance this? And I hope you'll join me. There's copies of the film are available out here at the book table, and you can go to itsagirlmovie.com and learn a lot more about it. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you today.